In 1983, Gene Simmons met Shannon Tweed at the Playboy Mansion. It would take him 28 years to finally marry her, but when they did in 2011, it wasn't really about romance. Their wedding was more about protecting an image and covering up a scandal that almost tore his family apart. Recently uncovered footage from their reality show has revealed private conversations that were never supposed to be seen by the public. On top of that, his son was caught in a plagiarism scandal, and legal documents from 2025 describe disturbing incidents involving female employees. The man who once bragged about sleeping with 4,800 women is now facing consequences that go far beyond the wild rock star reputation he built for himself. Gene Simmons wasn't born Gene Simmons. He came into the world as Chaim Witz on August 25, 1949, in Haifa, Israel. His story began in tragedy before he even took his first breath. His mother, Flora Klein, had survived the Holocaust. She was born in Hungary in 1925 and barely escaped the Nazi concentration camps. His father, Yehiel Witz, had also escaped Hungary. The two married in 1946 and moved to Israel in 1947, right before the new state was born. But even in this new land, their lives were haunted by the horrors of the past. By the time Chaim was 6 in 1955, things fell apart even more. His parents' marriage collapsed, mostly because of money problems. His father stayed in Israel and started a new life, but his mother was left to raise him alone in Mount Carmel. She worked long days in factories, sewing buttons to keep food on the table. Often, dinner was nothing more than bread and milk. As a child, Chaim did what he could to help. At 7, he and a friend picked wild fruit and sold it by the roadside. He even made his own winter coat from an old army blanket because he had no other choice. Life at school was no easier. Chaim was bullied for being different. Even though Israel itself was a place born from survival, the hatred his mother had escaped in Europe seemed to follow him into the classroom. At night, he would often cry himself to sleep in an empty house, his mother working late into the night. But something gave him comfort: comic books. He fell in love with American heroes like Spider-Man and Superman. He couldn't read English yet, but he studied them anyway. He already spoke Hebrew, Hungarian, and Turkish, but now he was secretly teaching himself English just so he could understand the adventures in those colorful pages. For him, those superheroes were more than stories, they were hope. By 1957, at only 8 years old, Chaim began to understand more about his mother's pain. Flora had been just 14 when the Nazis forced her into labor camps, making her dig potatoes in fields under guard. She wore clothes marked with crosses and was moved from one camp to another, watching her family disappear piece by piece. She rarely spoke about those days, but her silence, her protectiveness, and the sudden tears she sometimes shed told Chaim everything. Her trauma became his foundation, a deep, unspoken lesson to never be weak, to never let the world see him break. That same year, Flora made a decision that would change both their lives. With almost nothing but determination, she and her 8-year-old son left Israel and moved to Queens, New York. They arrived with no money, no English, and no family waiting to welcome them. His father stayed behind in Israel, remarried, and built a new family. Chaim would never see him again. After moving to America, Chaim Witz became Eugene Klein and tried to start a new life. Everything around him felt strange. Flush toilets, TV dinners, and the noise of New York amazed him, but adapting wasn't easy. His mother, Flora, worked long hours in Brooklyn factories, sometimes 15 hours a day, leaving young Eugene to take care of himself with babysitters. He felt out of place everywhere he went. At first, he went to a Jewish school, but he didn't fit in, so he switched to public school. When he graduated from Newtown High in 1967, he had already built up the resilience to survive in a country that never made him feel like he belonged. Kids teased him for his thick accent, and every insult reminded him he was different. Instead of breaking him, it pushed him to try harder. He picked fruit, sold cactuses door to door, and did whatever he could to earn money. At the same time, he forced himself to learn English faster by watching television and reading comic books. Pop culture became his obsession. In 1959, when he was just 9 years old, he legally changed his name again, this time to Gene Klein. He chose the name Gene after cowboy stars like Gene Autry. It was his way of becoming fully American, even though he still lived in a cramped apartment with his mother and cousins. His love for television only grew, especially with shows like The Ed Sullivan Show. Everything changed on February 9, 1964, when the Beatles appeared for the first time. Gene was electrified. He wanted that life, the stage, the music, the fame. He wanted to escape the boyhood of hunger and struggle and become someone unforgettable. Sometimes he even faked a British accent like the Beatles just to fit in. Girls liked it, and it gave him confidence, even though deep down he still felt insecure. Throughout the 1960s, Gene worked any job he could find. He cut meat in butcher shops, worked in delis, and earned barely over $1 an hour. Poverty had taught him to hold on to every cent, so he saved what little he made. He avoided alcohol at parties, noticing how it made other guys sloppy. Staying sharp gave him an advantage. He kept his head clear while everyone else stumbled. That confidence helped him with women, but his true passion was music. After seeing the Beatles, he picked up the guitar and practiced non-stop. He formed small bands with friends, each one bringing him closer to the life he dreamed about. In 1968, he enrolled at Sullivan County Community College. He studied education and graduated with an associate degree in 1970. He even worked as a 6th-grade teacher in Spanish Harlem, earning just $75 a week. But teaching was never what he wanted. Music was always calling. That same year, he teamed up with Paul Stanley and formed a band called Rainbow, which quickly evolved into Wicked Lester in 1970. They played gigs at night while juggling day jobs. Gene even worked at a fashion magazine and picked up translation jobs thanks to the languages he'd learned from neighbors and babysitters growing up: Hungarian, Turkish, and Spanish. But music was where his heart lived. At the same time, Gene's private life was already taking on the wild edge that would later define him. In his autobiography, he admitted that he lost his virginity at just 13 while working his newspaper route. The story, which he described in detail, revealed a side of him that shocked many fans. Wicked Lester became his first real taste of the music industry. In 1972, the band recorded a full album at Electric Lady Studios, the legendary space built by Jimi Hendrix. Epic Records spent heavily on the project, but when the A&R director Don Ellis heard the finished tracks, he hated them. He thought the sound was too messy and impossible to sell on radio. The album was shelved before release. The rejection devastated Gene. He and Paul Stanley had worked hard on the project, and now it was dead before it even had a chance. Furious, they fired members, shuffled the lineup, and eventually shut down Wicked Lester completely. But that ending created space for something bigger. Years later, after Kiss became famous, Gene and Paul paid $138,000 in 1977 to buy back the old Wicked Lester tapes just to make sure no one could release them. They feared the softer experimental sound would ruin the tough, hard-edged image they were carefully building for Kiss. Even though bootlegs eventually leaked online, songs like She and Love Her All I Can proved that Wicked Lester had been a stepping stone toward the band that would change rock forever. That failed band turned out to be the foundation for something much bigger. By January 1973, Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley were finished with Compromise. They wanted to create a band that was unlike anything people had ever seen. They first connected with drummer Peter Criss, who had placed an ad in Rolling Stone magazine after playing in bands like Lips and Chelsea. Soon after, they found guitarist Ace Frehley through a Village Voice ad. With the four of them together, something new was born. This wasn't going to be an ordinary rock band. They wanted theater, spectacle, and fantasy. Inspired by the shock rock of Alice Cooper and the glitter of the New York Dolls, they created Kiss. Their very first show happened on January 30, 1973, at a small Queens club called the Coventry, which had once been known as the Popcorn Club. Only a handful of people showed up, mostly girlfriends and a few friends, but that night Gene breathed fire on stage for the very first time. It was raw, strange, and unforgettable. Kiss didn't rely on radio or MTV in the beginning. Instead, they built their fan base through small live shows and word of mouth. Fan magazines spread their image, and kids who had seen them live couldn't stop talking. Within just a year and a half, the band went from performing to fewer than a dozen people to headlining Anaheim Stadium in 1974. By then, Gene had created his stage alter ego, the Demon. Inspired by horror movies, heavy metal imagery, and comic book characters like Black Bolt, he painted bat wings around his eyes, wore armor-like costumes, and turned fire-breathing and blood-spitting into his signature acts. Each member of the band had their own persona. Peter Criss became the Cat, Ace Frehley the Spaceman, and Paul Stanley the Starchild. At first, the makeup designs were improvised in front of mirrors, with each member trying to invent a character that no other band had dared to present. It looked bizarre, but it worked. Their earliest shows had fewer than 20 people in the crowd, but those who came left with stories they couldn't forget. Even without radio hits, Kiss was becoming a name people remembered. The makeup, the fire, and the blood transformed frustration into fascination. In August 1973, a man named Bill O'Coin saw Kiss perform at the Hotel Diplomat in Manhattan. He believed in them instantly and promised to get them a record deal within 2 weeks. True to his word, he landed them a contract with Casablanca Records, a brand new label started by Neil Bogart. The band signed on November 1, 1973. When Peter Criss heard the news, he was so excited that he literally fell off his platform heels. Kiss quickly went into the studio with producer Eddie Kramer and recorded their debut album. Released on February 18, 1974, it sold only around 75,000 copies, but the band refused to slow down. That year, they performed more than 300 live shows, helping keep Casablanca Records alive despite the label being close to bankruptcy. Even Neil Bogart, who had doubts about the band's bizarre makeup, realized it was drawing bigger and bigger crowds. By 1975, Kiss was filling stadiums without a single mainstream radio hit. Gene later admitted that the whole idea had been a gamble, but it paid off and turned them into legends. But while the band's fame grew, Gene's personal life was just as wild. Unlike other rock stars of his era, he never drank alcohol or used drugs, but he became infamous for his obsession with women. He started a habit of taking Polaroid photos with every woman he slept with, making them hold up the hotel key to prove the moment was real. Over the years, he claimed to have photographed nearly 5,000 encounters, boasting in interviews that he had been with more than 4,600 women. Not everyone admired this. Grace Slick from Jefferson Airplane famously called it disgusting. Gene kept the photos locked away in a box until decades later, when Shannon Tweed, the woman he eventually married, discovered them. On their reality show, she burned the collection on camera, closing that chapter of his life. Through it all, Gene's control, discipline, and wild stage character made him stand out. While others drowned in drugs and alcohol, he stayed sharp, turning his energy into power on stage. Everything shifted on September 10, 1975, with the release of their live album Alive. It captured the raw madness of their concerts, the fire, the screams, and the chaos that defined them. Recorded in cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Wildwood, and Davenport, the album exploded in popularity and turned Kiss from a struggling band into a national phenomenon. By the mid-1970s, Kiss had transformed from a struggling club act into one of the biggest names in rock, and their live album Alive was the turning point. Released in September 1975, it went on to sell over 4 million copies, officially going quadruple platinum on May 16, June 21, July 20, and July 23. It climbed to number 9 on the Billboard charts and stayed there for an incredible 110 weeks. The record didn't just make the band, it saved Casablanca Records from collapsing. At the time, the label's founder Neil Bogart was facing lawsuits and financial disaster, but Kiss's success pulled him back from the edge. The title Alive was inspired by Slade's 1972 live album and proved that Kiss's crazy mix of fire, blood, and makeup wasn't a gimmick. It was the future of rock. Their next leap came on March 15, 1976, with the release of Destroyer. Produced by Bob Ezrin, who had previously worked with Alice Cooper, the album pushed the band's sound into new territory. Ezrin brought in strings, reverse drum sounds, children's choirs, and dramatic effects. He threw out most of the 15 demo tracks the band had given him and rewrote, rearranged, and even played bass himself on Detroit Rock City. The result was their most ambitious record yet. Shout It Out Loud hit number 31 on the Billboard Hot 100, and Gene's God of Thunder became one of their darkest anthems. Some songs even pulled from classical music like Great Expectations, which borrowed from Beethoven's Pathetic Sonata. Recording sessions stretched from August 1975 to January 1976 at Electric Lady Studios, and the effort paid off. By the late 1970s, Kiss concerts weren't just shows, they were massive spectacles. The Dynasty Tour in 1979 had Gene flying across arenas while Ace Frehley's guitar fired rockets and the stage filled with smoke and explosions. Special effects wizard John Elder Robison helped create the jaw-dropping moments that wowed audiences. The band played 92 shows across North America, but cracks were starting to show. Some gigs were cancelled due to poor ticket sales, like the Pontiac Silverdome, and others were downsized. Peter Criss's drug problems made things worse. He sabotaged shows by stopping mid-performance, and by the final show in Toledo on December 16, 1979, it was obvious the original lineup was falling apart. The sound had shifted toward disco, families were replacing hardcore rock fans in the audience, and the band's edge was slipping away. Things only got stranger in 1978, when NBC aired Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park, a TV movie produced by Hanna-Barbera, the studio behind Scooby-Doo. The film featured Kiss as superheroes battling an evil inventor in a theme park. Gene leaned into his demon persona, improvising lines about world domination, but the acting was so bad that even fans hated it. The band was embarrassed, and people on set were told never to mention it again. Still, it became a cult classic overseas, especially in Europe, where it was retitled Attack of the Phantoms. That same year, all 4 members released solo albums on September 18. Gene's record outsold some of Kiss's group albums and included bizarre choices like a cover of When You Wish Upon a Star, plus guest appearances from Cher and Bob Seger. His songs were filled with nuclear fantasies and theatrical themes, perfectly in line with his larger-than-life ego. The band released Dynasty in 1979, featuring I Was Made for Lovin' You, which hit number 11 on the Billboard Hot 100 and sold over 1 million copies worldwide, going platinum in 5 countries. But the disco influence alienated their rock base. Ticket sales collapsed, venues shrank, and Peter Criss officially quit after only playing drums on 1 track. The original band was fractured beyond repair. In 1983, Kiss took a huge gamble. On September 18, they appeared on MTV and removed their makeup, revealing their real faces after a decade of mystery. At the same time, they released Lick It Up, which went platinum and brought fans back with a heavier, rawer sound. The gamble paid off and Kiss was reborn. By then, their business empire was booming, with over 100 licensed products ranging from action figures to lunchboxes, making millions in merchandise. Gene also branched into acting. In 1984, he played the villain Luther in Runaway, a sci-fi thriller directed by Michael Crichton.